I want to begin where it all began as far as my life is concerned. Most of you have never heard of this place probably or possibly. But I was born in 1939, December the 9th, 1939. I wish you'd take notes while I'm preaching. Put that in the back leaf of your Bible so that when December the 9th comes around, you can send me a gift. I was born December the 9th. You're still not taking notes. It's December the 9th, 1939. And some of you are saying, wow, eons and eons ago. Yeah, way back there in another dispensation I was born. But the place I was born was a little town, a little area called Benton, Illinois. That's on the southern side of the state of Illinois. I don't remember my birth. I remember my second one, but I don't remember my first one. And my mother, when she married my father, married a fellow that had a drinking problem. And she had 3 of us children, my older brother and my older sister, and I was the youngest. And by the time I reached the ripe old age of 2 years old, my mother had gotten fed up with the lifestyle of my drunken father. So, and of course, I'm not in memory of any of this. I just happen to have been told all of it later. So, my mother left my father, and she moved from Benton, Illinois to Chicago area. While she was in Chicago, she, of course, needed to support her children. She put a couple of us in orphanages and those kind of situations, that kind of care for a while. And she searched out a job, got a job, and working in conditions and places that no mother ought to be by any means, but she took the job to help support her family. And in this particular place where she was working, she was in a bar serving alcohol and liquor, the very thing that she left my dad for. She was now in another place that served it. And while she was there, there was a fellow that, and by the way, remember now she's divorced or divorcing my dad, and a fellow that's being discharged from the military was in Chicago, and he was on his last leg to be able to get his full discharge, and then he'll be heading to his home. Well, he happened to go to the same bar that my mother was in, and it just happened to be a relationship that was established between the two of them. And my mother fell in love with this fella, and this fella fell in love with my mother, and so they got married. And she, of course, had divorced my real father and married this fella, and his name was Leo Miller. That's how I get my name, Dean Miller. And because he adopted me. Now, the truth of the matter is, my mother should have had more sense than what she did in this area, because she had already divorced a man because of his drinking habit, and now she's in the bar, she's tending bar, and now she has this fella come in, and the very fact that he's there and he's drinking of the goods that she's selling would first be a flag in her mind. Hey, this guy is the same kind of a guy that I just got rid of. And the truth of the matter is, it didn't register with her. Love overruled everything, apparently, and she married this man whose name was Leo Miller, and he was a drunk too. And he moved us all, after his discharge was just a few months, he moved us all with him to Montana. And I was raised then from 2 years old all the way up to the age of 26 years old in Montana by this one, Leo Miller. Now you have to understand, Leo Miller was a staunch, dyed-in-the-wool Catholic. I mean, even though he had a drinking problem, to Catholics, and I'm not trying to be offensive if you're a Catholic here, but I'm just giving you the truth. You can go to confession every Sunday and confess that sin and have the priest absolve your sin and go right on with your same lifestyle after that. So being a Catholic did not make it any different for his drinking problem. He was a drunkard and continued to drink, but a strong Catholic he was. As a matter of fact, we no more had moved to Montana, and I was just a young guy of 2 years old. He had me baptized in the Catholic Church. He had my brother and my sister baptized in the Catholic Church. And then I got a picture of myself. I got a little old top hat, little white shirt, and I'm all dressed up, and I'm at my baptism of that particular Easter Sunday. And so he raised us not only just Catholics, but staunch, dyed-in-the-wool Catholics. I attended the Catholic summer schools. I attended Catholic schools to the point that I was indoctrinated with the Catholic religion. As a matter of fact, I could give to you, because I served as an altar boy, which simply meant that I spent a lot of time both with the nuns and with the priests, and I learned the Latin, and I could give to you the whole Mass in Latin. That's when we did it in Latin back then, and today I think they do it mainly with English today. But I could do the whole Mass, both the priest's part and the congregation's part, and how they respond back and forth to each other. And I could say all the prayers that's on the what they call the rosary, that's got the crucifix on the end of it. For example, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. How many ex-Catholics do we have in here that would know that prayer? You've got a few, all right. Oh my God, I'm heartily sorry for having offended thee, and I detest all my sins because I dread the loss of heaven and the pains of hell, but most of all because I offend thee, my God, and so forth. And I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. And I could give you all by rote memory that has been embedded in my heart and mind, all the prayers of the Catholics. I can go through the whole rosary and do penance even yet today, because it was given to me week after week after week after week. I mean, I was indoctrinated as a Catholic. So my dad raised me both then as a Catholic, and not only as a Catholic, but as a staunch Catholic. But there was something else about my stepdad that was terrible, that my mom, of course, had no clue that he would be involved in this, I'm sure. But my dad was not only a drunkard. By the way, he taught me to drink when I was by the time I reached my age of 4 years old. My dad used to get liquor, whiskey, and I'm talking about the old, like you would know, Sunbeams or early times is what my dad used. And he would pour out a shot glass of whiskey. And you know what a shot glass is, a shot glass of whiskey. And he would take that shot glass of whiskey and he'd say, "Come here, Dean." And I would go over to him and he'd give me that shot. Now, anytime you drink whiskey, an unsaved person drinks whiskey, that's what they usually have a chaser with it. It's either a beer chaser or a water chaser. In other words, you'll drink that shot down and then chase it down to something, because it's going to cause your body to have reaction to it because of its strength. It's a strong drink. That's what the Bible calls strong drink. So my dad taught me with first a shot glass of whiskey when I was 4 years old to be able to take that shot glass of whiskey, drink it down without a chaser, as they would call it, but not to react and have my body react like or make a face at it. Because that's normally what would happen because of the strength of that alcohol. But my dad made me drink it down, and then he'd beat the fire out of me if I had a physical bodily reaction to that drink. He wanted me to drink that whiskey without any reaction to it. After he had gotten to the place, after months of that, he'd got me to drink that whiskey. Then he brought the measure to what we call a double shot. When I got to the double shot drinking stage, where I could drink those double shots of whiskey and not have a physical reaction to it, my dad would take me to the bar, and we'd go into town. We lived on a ranch. We'd go into town, and he'd get all of his friends together, and he'd say, "Hey, fellas, I want to show you. I got a young man here. I mean, it's a real man. He's a bigger man than some of you guys are. Come here, Dean. I want to show him something." And my dad in that bar would take. And it's a country bar. You got to understand. There's no law there. He's not going to get in trouble, and he knew that. And he'd take a double shot glass, and he'd tell the bartender, "Fill that thing up." He'd say, "Come here, Dean. Come here." And he'd hand me that glass. He said, "Now watch this, fellas. Watch this. Watch it." And he'd say, "Drink it, Dean." And I'd take that glass, and I'd drink it back, never have any kind of reaction, never cough, never give it. And boy, all those guys say, "Man, look at that guy. What a little man. Wow, look at that guy." Well, if you got any sense at all, I'm sure you do, that was the beginning of causing this fella here to be addicted to alcohol. I became a drunkard. At the age of 4 years old, I was drinking hard liquor. But that's not all. And I'll not dwell on this at all. But God only knows. You fellas that are in this room right now, let me just have your attention for a moment. As much as is possible, you keep away from yourself and your children pornography. Now, I'm not going to say much about this, but I am going to just pass by it real quickly. My dad was in the military. He was in Germany. He was assigned to Germany in World War II. And when he came back and came home to be discharged after the war was over, he brought back with him little 8mm films of pornography. And he'd take my brother and me, when we were just preteens, into a room and show us on an old rickety kind of a projector some of the worst filth that you can imagine. You can't imagine, except for maybe you have seen some on your internet, or you've rented those videos. But you can't imagine a little boy that was exposed to such horrible, vile filth at a young age. You put those two together, you put liquor and pornography together, and you got yourself a problem child. And there I was with a stepdad that was not abusive physically necessarily. He did spank the fire out of me many times and beat the tar out of me. But he was abusive in that he got me involved. And you can ask my wife. She's sitting here right here. She knows exactly what I'm talking about. When she met me, I could not say one sentence without using some of the most horrible language you've ever heard. I mean, one sentence. I couldn't say one sentence without using some of the worst, dirty words you've ever heard in your life. Well, to make a long story short, my dad finally gave up the ranching work, and we moved out of the ranch, and we moved into town, and that's where things even actually got worse. We moved to a town where I was going to go to high school now. I'd already gone through my grade school age, and had already become addicted to those things I just mentioned to you. And now we move into town, and I'm going to high school. And while I'm in high school, this is in the early 50s, and it's in 1955. Well, as a matter of fact, if anybody knows about that, you know about that. That's when Elvis Presley came on the scene. And he came out with Heartbreak Hotel. Do you remember that? Those of you who are around, remember he came out. And right here in your area. And so every teenager in the world, no doubt, at that particular time in the 50s wanted to be like Elvis Presley, and I was no exception. I wanted to be like Elvis Presley. I went to his first movie, Love Me Tender. I went to all of his movies, Jailhouse Rock, you name them. I went to every one of them, and I wanted to look like him. I wanted to act like him. I wanted to be like him. Well, there's one thing that I had done as a little child. I had learned to play the guitar, and my dad had taught me to play the guitar. I used to play some guitar with my uncles and so forth. And so when Elvis came on the scene, I just adopted as much as is possible all of his lifestyle, his dress, his hairstyle, everything I could do to talk like him, sing like him, and everything. Make a long story short, I made a hit in our area of being the Elvis Presley of Montana, which meant that I was able to go to the nightclubs and the bars and be able to play. My wife can remember very well as she would sit sometimes even after I was married to her and go through my Elvis stuff in bars and nightclubs. I wish I had time to tell you something that Dr. Hiles did. Did I ever tell you about this? He heard about that, of course. And I'm preaching for Kevin Wynn in Mexico City. And they had asked me, Brother Hiles is there, and they asked me what it would take for me to do one stanza of an Elvis song. And I'd already given my wife a complete and total commitment that I'd never do it again, that I would never do it again. As a matter of fact, when I went to Bible college, I put my guitar away and sold it. I sold a Fender guitar with an amplifier, the whole business, got rid of it because I got converted, but I couldn't convert my music. So I got rid of it. Now, I gave that story, and Brother Hiles was sitting there when I was telling Kevin Wynn and some of the other guys there about it. And so Brother Wynn introduced me that night in his church as the first speaker just before Brother Hiles. But while we were sitting at lunchtime, he asked me, he said, what would it take for you to give one stanza of a song of Elvis Presley's and do all of the actions to it? And off the top of my head, I just jokingly said, $1,000. I wouldn't do it for less than $1,000, one stanza. Well, when Kevin Wynn introduced me, he said to his people something to the effect, we're glad to have Brother Miller with us, and he's going to preach to us. But just before he preaches to us, I've asked him to do one stanza of an Elvis Presley. And they had a guitar on the platform and everything. And you know what he did? He reached in his pocket and he pulled out 10 $100 bills. And he started counting them out. And I looked out, and Brother Hiles is dying laughing. He's the one that gave the $100 bills so that I could do that Elvis thing. Well, the truth of the matter is, I had to tell him, look, I told you that at lunch, but I can't do that because I'd already committed my wife that in public I'll never do that again. And I said, I can't lie to my wife. I'm going to keep my commitment to her. But she and she lets me do it at home. And so, but, and I think you saw this week up at the couples retreat just one little move there that I did. But anyway, it was Elvis Presley. It was the thing that I sought after and went after and so forth. All right, now get this. I was in my Elvis stage now when my wife came to town, and I met her. I was dating her sister, and I met her for the first time because her brother had been killed, and she came to Red Lodge, Montana, where I was, to go to the funeral service and so forth. And her sister introduced me to her, and that was when she was 13, and we had an off-and-on dating situation until we were 16. Now get this. I was raised a staunch Catholic. She was raised as much a staunch Mormon. We met and were married. But my life had not straightened out, and marriage did not straighten it out. All it did was, because of the drinking problem I had, and because of the associations that I was in, it got worse and worse and worse. We even moved to California one time to see if we could get our lives straightened out. Didn't work, came back. And when we came back, I moved from Red Lodge, Montana to Deer Lodge, Montana. And it was in Deer Lodge, Montana that I really, really, really had my drinking problem consume me. It was there that my wife and I were having, this is after now 7 years later, we were having the worst trouble we'd ever had in our entire marriage. As a matter of fact, the drinking had gotten out of control. My chasing around had gotten beyond limits. It was sad. I look at her today. Boy, I could have lost the most prized possession of my whole life. But I mean, it was the worst conditions you could have ever imagined. I was drinking one night with my friends, as I always did. I worked at a Chevrolet garage. I'd take my paycheck, every check I would make, instead of providing for my wife and the children any food and clothing or milk or anything, I would take that paycheck and cash it and use it to drink liquor with my friends and leave my family at home totally abandoned of any help whatsoever. And my wife got fed up with it, and I don't blame her. And she's sitting here today, and she knows full well it was probably the hardest thing that she ever went through. But I drank and I drank and drank. And one particular night, one incident took place. I was drinking so heavily that I gotten so drunk, and it was always at one place usually that I did this because that's where I met with my friends. It was at the Landon's Bar and Grill. And it was about 2:30 in the morning. I gotten so drunk that I didn't even know where I was. And somehow or another I'd staggered out of that bar and literally fell in the gutter. And I'm talking about where the street was and the step up to the sidewalk and laying out in front of that bar. And I was so drunk that if I moved my head any way at all, and some of you fellows that's ever been saved out of that kind of a lifestyle what I'm talking about, any time I would move my head, it would I would just swirl and make me dizzy, and then it would cause me to vomit. Well, it was to keep from moving my head so that I wouldn't get sicker. When I would vomit, I would just vomit, and the vomit would come up and just go all over my chest and all over my front. And there I am laying in that bar, literally totally helpless, never given one thought that it was my dad who brought this condition upon me. And there I was, literally heaving my guts out in just a mess, a stinking, rotten mess. If you can visualize a man laying in a gutter with vomit all over him, and so drunk he couldn't even find himself to stand up and walk back in the bar. He's just so drunk. But off in the distance, I heard footsteps at 2:30 in that morning walking my direction. I had no clue who it was. I could have cared less who it was. And those footsteps began to get a little louder as they came, and then all of a sudden I heard them stop, seemingly right there above me. And as best I could, I blinked my eyes through all the blurriness of that alcohol. And I looked up and I saw the face of my wife, filled with hatred and filled with anger, toward what she saw. You cannot believe how much I'd hurt that woman. And she's looking down at me filled with that vomit and filled with that condition of sickness. And have abandoned her and abandoned my children and abandoned my family. And she looked at me. And words that she couldn't form better any other way, and rightful words, she said, I've had it. You make me sick. I've had it. You make me sick. And I felt her toe as it kicked at my side. And I laid there totally helpless as I heard those footsteps turn away from me and fade off in the distance as she walked away. I don't know how it happened, but somehow or another I made it back to work the next day. And there I was. I worked that day, and the next day after that, I made it back to work. I'm standing there working, and in comes a uniformed sheriff. I don't know that they do that these days, but they did it in those days. This sheriff came in. He said, I'm looking for Dean Miller. And my boss pointed over behind the parts counter. He said, that's him right there. The sheriff in the uniform walked over there, and he said, you're Dean Miller? And I said, yes, sir. He said, here, and he put out a legal set of papers, and he put them down on that parts counter, and he said, sign these. I said, sir, what are they? He said, it's evident, if you look at the top, they're divorce proceedings. Your wife's getting a divorce from you. I said, sir, I don't want a divorce. He said, that's not my job. I'm not the counselor. It's my job to deliver you here to give you these divorce papers. But I said, I don't want a divorce. He said, sign the papers, sir. I've got to go on to my next job. Sign the papers. I said, I'm not going to sign them. I don't want a divorce. And we stood there and argued and debated. And he said, I'm going to tell you what. I'm going to leave those papers with you, but I'm going to come back and pick them up in 24 hours. You'll have those signed. Your wife is divorcing you. And he walked away. Make a long story short, at that particular time, I did not sign those papers, and I would not sign those papers, and now they were going to have to arrest me and put me away if I didn't. But let me continue with the story. During that particular time, what I did not know and what she did not know, during that time of separation and divorce, my wife was pregnant with another baby. And during this tough time of her seeking a divorce from me, she gave birth to that baby. She called him Dace Charles. My first name is Charles Dean. She called him Dace Charles. I'll hasten with this story only to tell you that Dace Charles was born with a defect in his heart. We got to go up to the hospital. I got to see him. We'd go separate times and so forth. We got to see him at the hospital. We couldn't hold him, but we could see him, and we could watch him through the glass. And he had a precious little countenance. And I'm down at the bar drunk again one night. Same bar, same situation. When my best friend came to me and ran up to me, he said, Dean, they sent me to tell you something. I got to tell you. He said, come outside so I can talk to you. And I said, no, sir, you want to talk to me? Talk to me right here. And he said, no, come on out. I got to tell you outside. And so, make a long story short, I went outside with him. And he told me, he said, Dean, they told me to come and tell you tonight your baby died. I said, you're kidding me. He said, no, your baby's dead. I said, I don't believe that. I just saw him. He said, no, your baby's dead. And I walked in that bar with anger. Now, bear in mind, raised a Catholic, staunch Catholic, could say the prayers, go to confession, have communion. And I walked in that bar and grabbed that bottle I'd been drinking of before he came and walked out in the streets of Deer Lodge, Montana. And I took that bottle and I held it up with my fist before God, and I said these words. As best I can remember, I said something to the effect, how can there be a God? How can there be a God? How can there be a God and take a little baby? And drank myself drunk. We had to meet. We had to plan a funeral service. We hadn't met before through this divorce proceedings, because now we have to meet because we have to plan a funeral. We go to the funeral home. And the funeral director brings in this little styrofoam casket, and he said, I'm going to start and show you what we have. And he brings in a nice casket first, and it shows them. He said, we can't have that. That's too expensive. He told us the price. He brought in another one. He said, that's too. And he said, this is the cheapest I got. And it's a little styrofoam casket. It looked like a little ice chest that you would buy down at Walmart to go on a picnic with. It had a blanket in it. He even had the screechy kind of a top when you lock the top. And they put the little baby's body in that. That's all we could afford. We couldn't afford a funeral home. We couldn't afford anything. She agreed to let the Mormons bury him, and I agreed to it too, since I was Catholic. She was Mormon, and the Catholics had already baptized him. And there we sat with our hearts broken and part of our own life taken away from us. Now we're going through divorce. We got our baby now dead. We can't even communicate and have any compassion with each other because of the anger of divorce. And now we can't afford the luxuries of a funeral where we get a funeral car to take the body out to the graveside. And so the funeral director said, you have to take the body out, and there's a fella out there that's at the gravesite, and he'll be waiting for you, and he'll show you where to drop the casket off. So we had a ride in an old borrowed station wagon with that little casket filled with our little baby's body in the back of it, cleared out of town to the cemetery. We got there, and a guy directed us to the place where the man was standing with a little mound of dirt there. And we backed that car up to that little mound of dirt and opened up that old back end of that station wagon. And she and I get out, and now hold it, we're not even speaking to each other. We're not even husband and wife. And now we got our own precious baby in that casket, and we unload that together. Our hearts are broken and wrenched. No answers. No help. No hope. We unload the little casket in that mound of dirt, and we look at each other. What do we do? And a man comes up and he says, I'll take care of it from here. And we get back in the car and we drive, and our hearts are torn. We had no answers whatsoever for life. None. And we pull away from that little baby's body. And no doubt her heart as a mother's was just wrenched. She lost her only child, or lost her child. And now she's got a heart that's bleeding. And now not even a husband to give her any comfort. And we drive away and we get back to the cemetery. No hope. No answers. The Mormon missionary that brought the funeral didn't give us any hope. No answers. She goes her way after we get to the funeral home. I go my way, and there I am standing there the next morning at the parts counter. And one of the guys came to me and said, hey, Dean, have you heard? They hired a preacher here to work at this garage. I said, a preacher? I'm a Catholic. A preacher? They said, yeah, that's him, way back there in the back corner back there, in that stall, way back there. I said, you mean a blankety-blank preacher? They said, yeah. 10 o'clock rolled around that morning. That's coffee break time. We all went to the coffee pot. And as I'm getting my coffee, other guys getting their coffee, here comes that preacher from back there in that corner stall. And he's got his cup, and he comes over. And when he comes, I take advantage of that. And I say, hey, fellas, let me tell you a story about a preacher I heard. And I started telling a dirty story. Dirty, filthy story. And he got his coffee, didn't say a word. He turned around and left this loud mouth and walked back to his stall. The next morning, I'm standing at my parts counter. I notice out of the corner of my eye as I'm serving these customers, somebody standing over here to my right. After I hand the parts, he slipped up. He came up to me and he said, Dean, he said, I know about some of the troubles you're going through and some of the problems you're having. And he said, I want to tell you something. He said, I came here today to let you know I'm praying for you, and I'd like to have you read this tract. And I saw that, and I looked at it, and I tore it in half. I just took that thing, tore it in half. I handed it back to him. Here's what I said exactly to him. I said, listen, man, I'm a Catholic. I'll die a Catholic. You keep your religion to yourself. I don't want to have anything for it. I tore that tract up and handed it right back to him. And about that time, another customer came, so he had to leave. The next morning, I'm still there at my parts counter the next day, exactly where I was the day before. And I see over here again. This time I look, and there he is. He's standing there, and the customers leave. He comes back up, and he's reaching in his pocket. But I'm looking at his face instead of his hand, and there's tears in his eyes. He's crying. His tears, literally a tear, is rolling down his cheeks. And he said, Dean, he said, I got up early this morning. And he said, I prayed just for you. Nobody had ever prayed for me. I want to tell you, a drunken fool, lost a baby, now lost a wife, and nobody had ever prayed for me. Nobody. And he handed me that tract. And this time, I didn't tear it up because somebody else was walking up. I grabbed it and I threw it behind me because right behind me is in the parts room. And the parts room has a typewriter where I do my parts orders. And I threw that tract on that typewriter. When lunch break came and everybody left the building to go on lunch, and I always did my parts orders, so I sat down behind that typewriter to roll in my parts order so I could type it out for that day during that lunch break because I wouldn't be interrupted. When I started to roll the paper in, there's that gospel tract sitting on top of it that I'd thrown there earlier in the day. And I looked at that tract and I thought, I better not let anybody see me have that. So I stood up and shut the door to the parts room so nobody could see me. And I sat there and I began to read that tract. The title of the tract was, What Must I Do to Be Saved? By Dr. John R. Rice. And I started reading that tract. And ladies and gentlemen, it started talking about sin, start talking about Christ dying for our sins, start talking about heaven, giving all the verses. And I can't explain it. You have to experience it. I can't explain it. But something was going on the inside of my heart. Here I am, a man that's getting a divorce, just buried his baby. In my life, I was a drunkard. I'm in sin like you could not believe. And I'm reading this on the tract, and I'm thinking, my soul, what do I do now? I see it, but what do I do? So I stuck that tract, folded it, and put it in my pocket, and I thought, I'm going to go back there and talk to him, but I don't want him to know I'm interested. And so I walked back, and I thought I'd try to carry on a conversation with him. I treated him so tough, so I thought I'd, get him to liking me and so forth. But I thought I'd form a question in such a way that he wouldn't even have a clue that I'd read that tract. And as soon as I asked him the first question, he said, he told me later, he's read that tract. So he made the invitation. He said, Dean, can I take you home tonight after work? Because my wife and I were, of course, separating, divorced. He said, can I give you a ride home? He said, we got to work late, and right after work, I'll give you a ride home. Make a long story short, we did our work. It was about 7 o'clock at night. We got done. I got in his car. He drives me to my house. I start to get out of my car to go into my house. And he reaches over and grabs a hold of my leg and stops me. He said, Dean, don't get out yet. Just a minute. Shut the door. And I shut the door, and he reached in his pocket, and he pulled out a New Testament. He reached up and flipped a switch on the dome light. That'll tell you how far back it was. They had the switches on the dome light up there. He flipped the switch on the dome light, and he started going through Romans 3:10, Romans 3:23, Romans 5:12, Romans 6:23, and so forth. And he came to Romans 10:9 and 10:13, and he was giving me, he's ready to pull that net. And when he's getting me about to be saved, I looked out my windshield, and sure enough, I saw a movement out there in front of my house. And I looked through that window and I said, Bill, that's my wife. He said, are you sure? I said, that's my wife. My wife's come home. And she was walking up to the door. And he jumped out and he said, Mrs. Miller? She said, yes, who are you? He said, my name is Pastor Wickham. And he said, I'm just showing your husband how to be saved. She said, good, he needs it. And he said, well, I'd like to show you too. And she gave a little argument and a little fuss, but he's motioning to me to come out of the car. I got out of the car, and we both went in the house. And he spent a few minutes there talking to us and explaining to us the need. And then he said he'd like to be able to show us out of the Bible how we both could be saved. She's Mormon, I'm Catholic. And he said, I'd like to show you how to be saved. And I'm going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, he took his Bible. And there was a couch sitting there just before the picture window. The picture window's out here. Main Street's right out there. And there's the couch. And he sets this Bible down on that couch. And he says, Dean, come here. He said, I want you to kneel down here at this couch. And I went and knelt down right there. And then he said to Mrs. Miller, he said, I want you to come and kneel down by your husband. And now he's going to show to us again, very briefly he showed to her, but he's going to show to me where he left off, Romans 10:13. But after he did that, he put my hand on top of that Bible, and for the first time, in who knows how long, he put her hand in my hand. And there on top of that Bible, our hands joined together for the first time. And both of us prayed and accepted Jesus Christ as our personal Savior. I went down on my knees, a lost, hell-bound, drunken, filthy, vile, no good for nothing sinner. And he led me to Christ, and I stood up, got off my knees as a saved man on my way to heaven, gloriously born again. Oh, I didn't know it. I didn't know all the answers. There was no big change. I didn't hear any bells ring. I didn't speak in tongues. But by faith, I knew that I was a lost sinner. And by faith, I knew that the blood of Jesus Christ was shed that I could be saved. And by faith, I knew, because He'd showed me, that all my sins that I've committed, all the dirty things that I'd looked at, all the dirty words that I had said, all the dirty actions that I had done, everything was forgiven. It's done. It's over. You've been cleansed of all your sin. I hurry with this. I got to hurry, but listen to this. I was there for 1 month, attended his church. We got baptized in Miller's Lake in Drummond, Montana. We moved to a big city, big to us, Billings, Montana. While I was in Billings, I was working as a parts man, and I finally got the job I'd looked for forever. And that was to be the parts manager of the largest Chevrolet dealership in Montana. I got the job. We attended a little Baptist church. I wish I could tell you how we found it. We attended a little Baptist church. It was meeting in a 2-car garage. A pastor had cleaned out his garage, set up some chairs, had a little platform, and is starting a church there. And Bill Wickham had recommended he come visit us and get us to go to that church. We're attending there for about probably a month or so, and he's up there preaching. His name is Ron Storrs. He's still a pastor, a very successful pastor in Everett, Washington, this very hour that I'm speaking. And he's there. He was there in that little garage, a big old tall guy, 6'5", 6'6". And when he would preach, he'd gather little saliva balls right in the corners of his mouth, and he always had a handkerchief, and he'd wipe those saliva balls off and keep on preaching, you know. And I sat there and I thought, boy, I like that. I like that. And I haven't even given up my cigarettes yet. I'm still sitting there I wasn't smoking in church, but I couldn't hardly wait till church is over so I'd go out there and get one. And so here he's preaching, and his message was, we need more preachers. We need more people to surrender to the mission field. We need more. And boy, God used that to reach down in the depths of my soul. And God stirred my heart that maybe I could be a preacher one day. And after that service, or after that message was over, he gave the invitation, and he began to sing, softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling for you and for me. And he looked out there at me, and I think it's an exaggeration, but I think that he was really doing it because God was moving in my heart, and there was something going on in my soul. I think the pastor could see it. And when he sang softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling, he'd always go like this, calling for you, and he'd point right at me. At least that's what I felt like he was doing. So when he did that, I would step out in the aisle to go down the front. And I thought, no, it can't be me. I stepped back in. And for 8 or 9 stanzas, I would step out. And he'd say, yeah, calling for you. And he's going like this, calling for you. And finally, I couldn't stand anymore. I stepped out and I ran down that aisle. And I grabbed a hold of that pastor. And I said, Pastor, I think God's talking to me. He said, I know He is. Yes, He is. And we hugged each other. And he said, God's calling you to preach, isn't He? And I said, I believe He is. And so we had a dance across the platform, you know. And he said, that's wonderful. That's great. And then he announced to the people. He said, I don't care if anybody ever comes down this aisle again. He said, what's happened here this morning is the best thing that happened in my ministry. Dean Miller's been called to preach. And I got back home, I got back to my wife, and I think she wondered the same thing. This can't be. How can this be? Drunken 6 weeks ago, and now not only saved, but now called to preach. And make a long story short again, an evangelist came. He was the president of the Bible college. It used to be the same Bible college Dr. Hiles was president of Denver, Colorado. It was the Baptist Bible College, and that president came and he spoke. And while he was speaking, that pastor told him that I was called to preach. That president zeroed in on me and said, you need to come to our Bible college. And make a long story short, my wife and I, after having the dream of our lives, of getting that job, we left that job and we moved to Denver, Colorado. I wish I could tell you. I might tell you tonight. We went there in an old 57 Buick, bald tires. Everything we owned was in a little old U-Haul trailer. And 4 little kids in the back screaming their heads off. And we went to go to Bible college. I'm at my first semester of Bible college. Get this. I'm at my first semester of Bible college. I'm at school. And my wife gets a phone call, and this man on the other end says, "Are you the Dean Miller family from Montana?" And my wife said, "Yes, we are." He said, "Wonderful." He said, "I have been trying to find you for over 20-some years." And he said, "I finally got a contact, and they said that you just moved to Denver, and I finally found out that this is where you are." He said, do you think that your husband would let me talk to him?" She said, "I'll ask him." And she got a name. She called me. We set up a time, and we met. When we met in the motel he was staying with, because he drove in with his family on vacation and had found out where we were and was searching for us and found out it was us. Now get this. He said, "I have tracked you down after all these years. You left when you were 2 years old. We lost track of you. Nobody ever kept contact." He said, "I am your uncle." I said, "From where?" "Benton, Illinois." I said, "I've never been to Benton, Illinois." See, my mom never told me. My mom never told me I was even adopted. He said, "Yeah, you're from Benton, Illinois." I said, "No, I'm a Miller." He said, "No, you're not." And he began to give us some proof. And he said, "Here's what I want to do. I want you to meet your real dad." When he said that, my heart sunk. He said, "You have 11 aunts and uncles, and you have a real dad that's back in Benton, Illinois." And he said, "I want to pay your way out this Thanksgiving, and I want you to meet them." Again, a long story short, I packed my family up at Thanksgiving holiday, and we drove to Benton, Illinois. When we got there, I'm standing in the living room of my uncle's house, and inside that door, he went and got my dad, and outside that door, he brought my dad, and my dad's the only one that stepped in, and my other uncle stayed on the outside. My family was already in the kitchen, and my dad and I met for the first time. I'll never forget it as long as I live. He looked across that room, and he said, "Dean." I said, "Yes, sir." He began walking toward me, crying. He said, "I'm your dad." He said, "Oh, Dean." He held me back, and he looked at me. He said, "Look at you. Look at you." And he hugged me close to him. He said, "Look at you. You're my son. Oh, my son, my son. Would you forgive me? Oh, my son." And we had a wonderful time of getting acquainted. And then he said, "Quick, my dad, let's get in the car." And we drove down the street, got down to a house, walked in, don't miss it, walked into this house, took us down a little hallway, and he started to reach for the doorknob, and he said, "Now watch this, watch." And he opened the door, and he motioned to me to come, and I stood there in the doorway. And there's 2 old people laying in the bed, one on one bed here, one old bed, one bed over there. And my dad and my uncle said, "Grandmama, Grandpapa, we got somebody here that you want to see, and we want to introduce him to you. And you'll never guess who it is." And my little old bony, frail, 96-year-old grandmother raised that little old finger out of those covers and pointed out. She said, "I know who that is. That's Deanie, isn't it?" And he said, "Mama, yes it is. How did you know?" And I went over there by her, and she reached up and grabbed a hold of me with those little old bony hands and pulled me down to her. And she said, "Oh, Deanie, I've prayed for you for 26 years. I did not even know where you were or if you were alive." Now get it. The old man lay next to her, 94 years old. And she said, "Meet your grandpa." And I went over, and he reached out and grabbed a hold of me. And he said, 26 years we have prayed and waited for this day. And my dad said, "Dean, do you know what he is? Do you know what he is?" I said, "No. I've never." "Tell him, Grandpa. Tell Dean what you are." And he looked up with tears rolling out of his eyes. And he said, I'm just a Baptist preacher. And my uncle said, and you got 3 Baptist preaching uncles. I said, you don't mean it. You mean to tell me for 26 years I've had Baptist people? Yeah, my grandma says, but we've prayed for you every day that God would find you and God would save you. And I want to give this testimony. 26 years. My grandma and grandpa Brzezinski, that was their last name, Brzezinski, prayed for me, not knowing where I was, not knowing what I was doing. They had no clue that my life was in the condition that it was in, that I was a lost, hell-bound, wicked, vile, getting a divorce, sinful sinner of all sorts. And their prayers were bombarding heaven for every day of my life that God would send somebody. And here comes a gospel tract. What must I do to be saved? In a little remote town of Deer Lodge, Montana, as the very direct result of somebody praying for this preacher right here. Somebody praying for this old sinner. And God saved me out of that life of sin, called me to preach, and put a chunk of joy and happiness and salvation in my soul. And I have been preaching the gospel now for 37 years because of the prayers of somebody that took me out. That prayer reached down and grabbed me and pulled me out of that sin and set me with the princes of his people. I want to tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. You can't get so far away from God but what God can save you. And you don't have a loved one so far away from God but what your prayers can be answered by God and get somebody saved. Our problem is we're not praying. And our problem is we're not believing. But you're looking here at living proof that there was no hope in sight ever for this guy right here. Except for a little frail grandma and grandpa that were Baptist people that saved this old Catholic out of steep religion and steep sin, and saved that little Mormon gal right there, and put our marriage back together and gave us a family to serve God together. God can do anything. Bow your heads with me, please. Every head bowed and every eye closed. I'm talking to somebody this morning. You're probably yourself lost and on your way to hell. You're lost. You're wondering, how in the world could God ever save me? If God can save a person like me or anybody else in this room, God can save you. You can't go so far but what God can reach down and take you out of the dunghill. God can take you out of the dunghill and save your soul. I wonder who's in the room right now and say, Pastor Miller, right here where I'm seated, right here, I'm not even going to have to make a move. I'm going to trust Jesus Christ to save me and take me home to heaven. I'm a sinner and I realize it. I believe Jesus Christ died for my sins, and I'm going to accept him as my Savior, sitting right here, right now where I am. I believe God can change me. Maybe not change me to be a preacher, but he can change me to be ready for heaven. And God's spoken to your heart. Would you raise your hand so I could rejoice with you that you're going to accept Christ as your Savior? Hold it up real high. Let me see it. Just lift it up real high. God bless you. Thank you. Who else? Who else? Hold it up real high. I want to go to heaven when I die. Pray for me, Brother Miller. I want to go to heaven when I die. I believe God can save me as much as he can save anybody else. And if he can save you, he can save me. Who else? Hold it up real high. Let me see it. All right. Who's here? You got somebody that's a loved one. You got somebody that's lost and is a friend, or maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a son, maybe it's a daughter, maybe it's a mother, a father, a grandmother, a grandfather, an aunt, an uncle. But you know somebody God's laid on your heart right now that you know is lost and going to go to hell if somebody doesn't pray for him and get him saved. And God's laid somebody on your heart right this moment. Would you lift your hand, please, all over the building? All over the building. Oh, my. Oh, my. Yes, yes. Hands all over this building. There's folks that's right now dependent on your prayers. I don't know if you know that or not, but there are people dependent on your prayers as much as I didn't even know it. I'm saved because of the prayers of my grandparents and my family. Heads are bowed, eyes are closed. Stand quietly to your feet, please. Everybody standing. I want the instruments to play through just one song. And I wonder how really important that loved one God's laid on your heart is to you. I wonder if it's important enough for you to leave that seat on a Sunday morning and march down this aisle and kneel at an old-fashioned altar and call that name out before God. Just call that name out before God. Tell God who it is that you're praying for, that you want to see saved. As they play, you come now all over this building. Just come on. All over this building. They're playing and you're coming right now.